Good morning, Bruins. My name is Haider Leon, a fellow Bruin and the Assistant Director of Affinity Programs here at the UCLA Alumni Association. Thank you for joining us today for Alumni Day Online. It's great to have you with us. In this hour, we'll be exploring memory and aging, remembering what matters the most, and through an interactive Q&A session with Dr. Alan Castel. Alan Castel is a professor of psychology here at UCLA. He received his PhD from the University of Toronto and is internationally recognized for his research on human memory, attention, and cognitive aging. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Time Magazine, and his latest book is entitled Better with Age, The Psychology of Successful Aging. Now, before we get started, I'd like to thank our Blue, Gold, and Life members for making events like Alumni Day possible. It is through your generous and continued support that we can plan events and provide resources for all Bruins. Now, we do hope that this will be a highly interactive Q&A session, so please submit your questions to our live chat and we'll answer as many as possible. Let's get started. Dr. Castel, can you tell us a little about yourself and how you became interested in the research of memory?
Certainly. I became interested in memory when I was younger because, to be honest, at times I didn't have a very good memory. But when I really put my mind to something, I figured out ways to memorize. And I learned this at an early age when I had to memorize things in school, times tables, and then later in high school, the periodic table. So I learned tricks or mnemonics that helped me memorize. Unfortunately, this didn't necessarily lead to good learning all the time. So even though I could memorize things, I learned that I wasn't always learning. So this is this idea of metacognition or meta-memory, awareness about your own memory and how it functions. And I had older grandparents, and I noticed that despite their memory changing, sometimes they would forget my name or call me by my brother's name, they were very good at remembering things from 50 years ago, or even the price of something they purchased yesterday, something they cared about. So I became interested in how memory changes as we get older, not simply how it declines. And I fell into some really interesting research when I was in college on how people remember, how people forget, how this happens in a classroom, but also how this happens in the real world as we get older. So that led me to this, what I think is an exciting career as a scientist, studying how we age and how our memory changes as we get older.
Thank you for sharing that. It's always interesting how we find our career passions often through a mix of personal experiences and oftentimes what we discover ourselves in college. So let's dive right into your expertise. Just starting with the very simplest of terms, what is the difference between a young person's memory and an older person's?
Well, I think as we get older, and it's a continuum age, it's very hard to say who is an older person, but even after the age of 20, our memory starts to change. And many would think of this as a decline, where you have trouble remembering names. We might even forget where we put our keys. At my age, I start to forget, where I put my glasses, and sometimes I call my children by their incorrect names. These types of memory changes can sometimes be concerning, but really they can be explained in terms of how memory functions. As we get older, we accumulate more information. And as a result, it's harder to access the information we need at any given time. Sometimes that results in this tip of the tongue feeling where you know something, but you can't recall it. Or this experience where you walk into a room and you can't remember why you walked into that room. So sometimes we're distracted. And as we get older, we might feel like our memory is declining. But really what's happening is our memory is changing. Our memory will never fill up, but we'll have this experience where we have all these names in our memory, but we can't recall a specific name for a specific person. I think as we get older, though, we actually learn more about our memory. So this is, again, this concept of meta-memory or metacognition, that as we get older, we learn what we'll remember and what we'll forget. And probably more importantly, we learn what's important to remember. Today, we can offload a lot of information onto Google. We can look things up on Wikipedia. So what do we really need to know personally? And that's kind of the research that we're interested in. How do we selectively remember important information? And maybe somewhat paradoxically, as we get older, despite experiencing more memory challenges, maybe we're actually better at being selective about what we want to remember.
I I really enjoy all the examples that you give because these are examples that I think many of us have experienced in the past. I know my mother, for instance, always names all three of my siblings before she gets to me. We've all had that experience of losing our car keys. And I do want to touch more on your research on aging. But first, I would like to ask, through your research, have you found prevailing myths about memory? And could you debunk some of those for our viewers?
Yeah, there's certainly some myths about memory, and some of them revolve around what can we do to improve our memory. And really, there aren't any real shortcuts. You know, if you want to remember a name, like my name, maybe you've forgotten it already, but I can tell you again, my name is Alan Castel, or I can test you for my name. And we know that if you test people, it can actually strengthen the retrieval pathways so that people then will remember the name better if they've had to produce it instead of just being told the name again. Then if we tie a name to something we know already, so if I say, my name is Castel, my last name is Castel, it rhymes with pastel. All of a sudden you can imagine a pastel and you can connect it. Maybe my grandfather was a painter, he used pastels. And now you can tie that new information to things you know already. So this can really enhance how we remember names. And I think this is important because there's a lot of myths out there that, you know, you can improve memory by simply eating blueberries.
Right.
Or that crossword puzzles enhance memory. And the truth is, you know, there could be some evidence that, you know, nutrition can help memory, or that crossword puzzles, if you're doing them, that's great. But it doesn't necessarily mean that doing more crossword puzzles, especially if you're not interested in them, will help memory. And so I think one important myth is that, you know, brain training can be very effective and helpful, and it's important to challenge yourself in situations, meeting new people, traveling, trying new things, trying to recall things. But some of the brain training, such as a computer-based brain training, can lead to improvements in your attention and memory for the tasks that you're training yourself on, but they don't tend to transfer to things that you might care about in terms of remembering someone's name, remembering where you put your keys. And so I think we have to be careful when we talk about brain training, because there's different types and different varieties. And I think the best brain training we can do is really brain training in the real world, trying to remember people's names, where you parked your car, and then be more effortful and present about remembering this. A lot of it comes down to attention, that if you really focus and pay attention to something and then do something that makes that information memorable, like make a mental image of it or connect it to something you know, then you'll remember it well. And there's no real shortcut yet in terms of, you know, just training yourself using computer-based tasks. And I think another interesting finding that dispels some myths about how to improve memory is the best thing you can do to really improve your memory over a long period of time is physical exercise. So several studies have now shown that if you walk 3 or 4 times a week for 45 minutes, your memory will be improved. And in fact, the brain imaging evidence shows that the hippocampus, the part of the brain that's really involved in recalling information, actually grows in size. Typically, this part of the brain declines in volume after the age of 50 by about 1% every year. And in this one study, they found that people who were told to walk 3 times a week for 45 minutes, their hippocampus volume actually increased by 1% over a 1-year period. And this, of course, led to improvements in a variety of memory tasks. So really, although we think of brain training as, you know, mental activity, physical activity can play a really big role in terms of how we can then remember information. And of course, walking can be good for all sorts of things beyond just memory, physical health, mental health, especially if you're walking with a friend or a partner, getting outside. And so I think that's an important thing to consider, is this mind-body connection, that, you know, physical exercise and walking can be as beneficial, if not more beneficial, than a lot of the brain training, you know, programs that are out there.
That is so interesting. So from what I heard you say, you know, often people say that some people just have bad memories, or that as you grow older, your memory decline is inevitable and there's nothing you can do about it. But from your research, what you're finding is that exercise and walking, using those mnemonics, can not only help memory ability, but it also can help you remember all those small things like people's names, which is very important, especially from the alumni side for networking purposes. Now, if I could dive in more into those strategies for memory retention, would they differ if you're 30 versus 50?
It's a good question. I mean, I see a lot of students, undergraduate students at UCLA, who have exceptionally good memory, but they have challenges selectively focusing on what information is important to remember. So sometimes a student will come to me during office hours and say, I got a C on the exam, but I studied really hard. What's going on? And I'll have a conversation and realize when they show me their textbook, they've highlighted almost 80% of the material. Which suggests they're really reading the textbook. Maybe they're doing some passive studying, but really what you need to do is kind of centralize that information and figure out what are the important themes to remember. And I think that's something when we're young, we rely a lot on our memory. But as we're older, 40, 50, 60, we realize we can't remember everything, and we try and distill information or kind of shrink it down into the important themes. So I do feel like it's almost like you could think that gets better with age. Maybe as a result of not being able to remember as much, we're better at selectively focusing on what's important. And another thing that I think is important when we talked about activities and what we can do is attitude. If you have an attitude that it's all downhill, or as we age, it's inevitable, there'll be memory decline, research has shown that you'll probably then experience more memory challenges and feel like you can't do anything about it, compared to individuals who feel like, memory changes, or as you get older, our brain doesn't all fall apart. There's a lot you can do, starting from physical exercise or using these mnemonics, activities that you might enjoy, taking up hobbies, being around other people that can really stimulate both your brain and your mental, acuity.
That is so interesting. And, as I hear you speak, I think about the application of your research in educational settings and during business transactions and building relationships, everyday life, from grocery stores and the keys, remember people's special occasions. So I'm just really in awe of the application of your work. So I want to dive in even more. I'm curious. Sometimes people experience simple forgetfulness. And I'm wondering what's the difference between simple forgetfulness and a cognitive impairment that should be followed up on with a doctor or some other health professional.
It's a great question, and it's certainly a concerning one. I do try and emphasize the positive aspects of aging, but the truth is, as we get older, many of us will show signs of dementia, and we want to know what are the earliest signs of dementia so that we could maybe get treatment, even though there's no real medical treatment out there that will prevent dementia. So developing objective memory tests can be important, although some evidence shows that before we show memory decline, we actually show declines in attention, so we stop being able to attend to things as well. One kind of joke is that if you can't remember where you parked your car, that's actually a normal sign of aging. Or you've parked your car in this parking lot many times, and you've probably seen people who have to use their keys to find their car by sound. But if you can't remember if you own a car, that's more a sign of dementia. Now it's not an attention or memory issue, it's more this issue of you don't have your identity still. And so that's one way to kind of conceptualize this difference between being able to remember things, but remembering also comes with some normal forgetting. And I think a lot of people experience anxiety if they forget something. If they're 50, 60, and they're forgetting things, they're worried, is this dementia? And oftentimes it isn't, because these are predictable and normal memory challenges that we all experience. But in many cases, these can be telltale signs of biological changes in the brain. But I think what's interesting is, given that there's no medical treatment for dementia, there are a lot of things we can do to prevent dementia, sometimes 10, 15, 20 years before it sets in. And one of those things is, physical exercise and walking and having a stimulating life. Oftentimes people don't want to retire because they lose a lot of social connections and kind of the challenge in their life, or they're excited to retire only to be kind of unpleasantly surprised that now their life doesn't have as much meaning, or they're not getting up in the morning with kind of things to do and people to see. So I think these sorts of transitions in life, from retirement, to then leading an active life, are important. You want to make sure you have a social support network, people who care about you, but also, focusing on things that you might find interesting, whether it's hobbies, whether it's even taking on a second career in something that might be stimulating.
That's fascinating, Dr. Castel. So just to clarify, I have to say, I love your very Bruin optimist answer there. Because there is no cure for dementia, why not focus on the things that we can do to improve our memory for as long as possible? And just to be clear, so a cognitive impairment that needs follow-up would really come about if forgetfulness becomes maybe a regular thing or a consistent, would you say?
It's true. If you feel like you're forgetting things more and more often and it's impeding your lifestyle, or if a partner is starting to notice these changes and it's happening more frequently for more important things, you should consult a neurologist. And a neurologist can then do some memory tests to determine if these might be the signs of dementia. Currently there's no absolute test for Alzheimer's disease or dementia. There can be clinical diagnoses which suggest that you have some sort of form of dementia, but it's very difficult to tell someone you absolutely have dementia. I mean, oftentimes people do develop these forms of dementia where you're getting lost when you're walking out the door, you can't find your way. So this certainly suggests that there's brain pathology and things that might not be reversible. But sadly, there is no cure. So I think right now we need to focus on prevention. And sometimes prevention is not, now I'm developing these terrible signs, what do I do? It's 5 to 10 years before that to ensure that we remain active, remain positive, surround ourselves with people that we care about, that are interesting to us. So I think that's almost kind of the most important message, that it's a preventable disease potentially, but it's not necessarily a disease you can cure.
Okay. So Dr. Castel, we do have some live questions being sent in. So many folks, for example, Eric is asking, are there connections between improving focus and memory?
It's a great question, especially in this day and age where we're surrounded with technology, and sometimes we don't need to focus on things for more than a minute or two, because then an email comes in, or then a child is crying, or then we check our phone for an update on the game. And certainly there is some evidence that people mind wander considerably. Distraction can be a real issue when we drive as well. So there certainly is a link between focus, distraction, and memory, that you're not going to remember things as well if you're not focused. People feel like they can multitask, even though really multitasking is really rapid task switching. So if you can improve your focus, then you can improve your memory for what you care about. Having said that, it's also a natural feature of our minds to mind wander. We're on a task for 5 or 10 minutes, it reminds us of something else, then we start thinking about that, and before you know it, you're somewhere else. And that can sometimes be a form of creativity, that if we want to find a solution to a problem, sometimes we can't just think about it for an hour or two. We need to focus on it for a little bit, then distract ourselves, think about something else, and then some sort of alternative solution can come to mind. So I think it's important to be focused when we really need to remember something. Like if I really want to remember your name or this conversation. On the other hand, a lot of time in our life is spent kind of mind wandering or thinking about other things, and that can be beneficial.
I love that. And and this kind of dives into your a lot of what you have said dives into your most current research that's also featured in your latest book, Better with Age: The Psychology of Successful Aging. You've transitioned from just looking into memory into the aging process overall. So I'm wondering, how would you define successful aging?
It's a great question. I mean, I've been excited and interested in aging in the context of memory, because it's the first thing people say, oh, I'm getting older and my memory is changing, should I be concerned? But when people come into our memory lab at UCLA, a lot of times, these older individuals, and when I say older, we have an arbitrary cutoff of 60 and above, but we've had people who are 95, 100 come in, sometimes with their 70-year-old son. So we get all sorts of people, and oftentimes they do show these amazing signs of being active, being curious and interested in what they're doing. Sometimes they're retired, sometimes a spouse has passed away. So there's a variety of forms of successful aging. Sometimes people feel like they can't retire from a job because it defines them, and that's kind of how they stay active. So successful aging certainly involves kind of staying free of, health concerns, but there's a big social component. And as we test people in our lab at UCLA, I started to learn about the diversity that's associated with aging, but also older adults are actually, the ones we often test are in pretty good spirits. They have high life satisfaction. They're interested in being part of a research study and talking to students. So that made me kind of think of memory and aging in a broader context. A lot of these people are retired. They're giving back to the community. They're interested and curious as to what's going on. And so I started doing some more informal interviews that weren't just memory tests with older adults, talking about what's important in life. What are the secrets to successful aging, if there are any? And I got a variety of answers ranging from, staying active, being positive. Some people would say, spending time with grandchildren. Some people would say spending time with grandchildren, but not too much time, right? So there's a lot of, interesting responses. And that then led me down this road to think of who are our mentors for successful aging. Like if you had to think of someone who, when I say successful aging, who do you think of? And people would often say, oh, one of my, old basketball coaches, or, the mail carrier, or my grandmother or grandfather. And so if we have these mentors who show us how to age well, maybe that can allow us to follow in their footsteps. Even if there aren't specific secrets, one or two secrets, there's probably many. And so I then began interviewing other more notable people like, UCLA's former basketball coach, John Wooden, asking him these same sorts of questions. What are the secrets to successful aging? And, he didn't really have a specific example, but he did say stay positive, stay active, and have some variety. And I think those are kind of important themes that did come up in these interviews.
That is fascinating. I can't believe you met and interviewed John Wooden for your research. I think in your book, you also interviewed Maya Angelou. Is that correct?
Yeah, I interviewed Maya Angelou, and she, was an incredible person who worked on topics, and her writing is very expressive, and she, also stayed very active late into her life. She was a very busy person, and she too remained positive, but also experienced a lot of trauma in her life. And she said she tried to focus on the positives later in life and really compartmentalize some of the things that happened to her earlier in life, even though a lot of her writing still expresses some of these topics. So I think people, deal with life challenges in different ways, and life challenges certainly don't go away as you get older. In fact, oftentimes we're presented with more challenges, sometimes health concerns, family issues. But another theme that really came up that John Wooden spoke to as well, and it's highlighted in the book, is balance. It's really important to have both physical balance and mental balance in life. And especially as we get older, older adults would say, now that I'm retired, I can do more of the things I enjoy and less of the things I don't enjoy, but I still like to work part-time, or I still like to have grandkids over or family over, but maybe not over all the time or living with me, because that throws things out of balance. And of course, there's physical balance, that even though we might be concerned about how our memory changes as we get older, probably what's more concerning and sometimes preventable is having good physical balance. So balance training, just being able to stand on one foot for 5 seconds, really challenges your cerebellum. And if we do this every day and really start challenging ourselves, that might be able to prevent a fall, because that's really what will lead to this cascade of health issues. Is if you fall at home and you're 70, you break your hip, then you're in the hospital for 4 weeks. Now you've lost physical exercise, your memory starts to decline. Who knows what else might happen when you're in the hospital, when you get out. It's a really challenging time. So balance is probably one of the most important things as we get older. And that was one theme that emerged from a lot of these interviews.
That is so fascinating. We do have a question, Dr. Castel, from Brian. His question is, how much is memory tied to hereditary factors? And is the way our parents and grandparents are experiencing memory the way that we're going to experience it as we grow older?
It's a great question because there certainly is, a biological basis to memory that is inherited. Having said that, as a psychologist, most of my research focuses on what we can do ourselves, regardless of our kind of genetic predisposition. So it's also concerning that, if you had a grandparent who had dementia or a grandparent who lived well into old age, you might think, well, that's just the path that I'm set on. And that's not necessarily true. So even though there are kind of genetic markers for dementia, even if you have some of these markers, the likelihood of you developing dementia might be 5 to 7% higher, let's say, which, is notable. But if you walk every day, you can offset that quite easily. So even though there are certainly biological markers for aging and dementia, I think there's a lot we can do in terms of physical activities, in terms of being involved and engaged in stimulating activities that might be able to offset some of these genetic coding. And sometimes it's good to say, well, my grandparents lived to 100 or my parents are doing well, but you have to ask yourself, like, is that all they're doing? What else? Just because they have good genes. And so sometimes people will say, the trick to successful aging is to pick your parents wisely. And although I find that amusing, I think it's more like, what have your parents taught you that can help you age well? And I think we all, when we think of successful aging, we do think of our parents or grandparents. And if you could take your pick of what things they did well and what things maybe they're not doing well, that might be a good way to arm ourselves, in complement to our genetic backgrounds.
Right, and so that we can take back some kind of ownership and power in terms of determining how it is that we age and not letting those hereditary factors determine that for us.
Certainly.
I'm learning about psychology so much, the field, and what an optimistic field it is. Thank you, Dr. Castel. I'm curious to know, you've explored memory and aging for so long. Are there questions that still get at you and you're passionate to pursue further?
Absolutely. I think as you study this more, there's just more questions. And some of them have to do with the biological basis of memory, like how do brain structures change as we get older? But some of them are kind of the strategies that develop in response to brain changes. And also, probably one of the most exciting things is how technology is changing how we use our memory. So, teenagers today are using their memory in very different ways than, when we were younger, or if you're 60 or 70. Certainly it's much different. So is that going to have long-term effects on, how we use our memory, perhaps in good ways and in perhaps not so good ways? Maybe we don't need to burden our memory with things that we spend a lot of time memorizing. On the other hand, a lot of older adults would say one way that they tend to relax is to recite poetry or to relive memories, to reminisce about times they enjoyed. And so I think our memory is very much our identity. And so, and that's why it's concerning if you develop dementia that you start to lose this identity. But some older adults would say that the way they try and stay sharp is to relive these moments and to recall them and to be around people who can also share these stories about, events that happened 30, 40 years ago, but also events that happened last week. So if you have some sort of social club or a hobby group that meets, that can be very, very stimulating. So I'm very interested in kind of how all of this comes together. Like I said, I started really just studying memory, but realizing that memory doesn't work in a vacuum. You can alter your memory, you can change your memory, you can have false memories. So I'm interested in how all of this kind of comes together, and what we can do to both improve our memory, but also improve our life so that we can age well.
Dr. Castel, I'm so impressed by your research and all the work that you do. As you talk more about these questions, I see that you're working with teenagers and technology, older adults who are 70 and older, or maybe 100. You're touching a lot of lives in a lot of different fields and industries. So again, I'm just in awe of the research that you're doing. And as you talk about older adults, reading poetry, and Maya Angelou saying that she likes to focus on the positive, I'm reminded by a quote of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who says that the heart's memory eliminates the bad and magnifies the good. These writers just have a poetic way of putting things, don't they?
It's a great quote, and I don't know, how old that author was when it was written, but it is one thing you tend to find that as you get older, you do focus on the positives, and not that you forget the negative information, but you just don't dwell on it as much. And so research has documented this kind of positivity effect or positivity bias. And that might be what keeps older adults kind of happy and centered. Whereas when we're younger, we might have to focus more on negative information for survival. But I think it's true, and that's why, another myth of aging is that as we get older, we can get, have more life satisfaction, experience happiness in ways that maybe we didn't experience when we were 20 or 30. And a lot of older adults will say they are happier now than they were when they were younger, even though when they were younger, a lot of important, exciting, and happy events did happen to them.
That's such a positive and great message to spread, because I think a lot of folks do have anxiety about growing old and what satisfaction is going to look like for them at different stages of their life. Thank you for sharing that. We are coming to a close with our time, but again, Dr. Castel, thank you so much for this great conversation.
Thank you. It was great chatting with you. Go Bruins.
Thank you, Dr. Castel. Now, to everybody watching, thank you for joining us today and participating in this discussion. I love the live chat questions. And if you missed a portion of this conversation, please note that a recording of it will be in the UCLA Alumni YouTube channel. And once again, thank you to our Blue, Gold, and Life members for making conversations like this possible. Enjoy the rest of Alumni Day, and go Bruins.